Good afternoon.
Hello.
My name is Dr. Rebecca Dean. I'm the Senior Associate Dean in the College of Liberal Arts and a political scientist. I'm so pleased that you could join us today. What began in 2005 with a generous donation by UT Arlington alumnus Mustaq Ahmed has grown into an endowment funding dynamic programming that showcases unique aspects of the arts, humanities, and social sciences. By appealing to a multidisciplinary audience, the Festival of Ideas brings together the 12 departments and 4 centers that make up the College of Liberal Arts. Before I introduce today's event, I want to thank several people who have been critical in making this season successful. The Native American Students Association, the Departments of History, English, and Sociology and Anthropology, and specifically Dr. Stephanie Cole and Sam Haynes, who are both here in the audience today. They were on the ground floor of the planning of this season. They, along with Dr. Les Ridingman, Assistant Dean in the College of Liberal Arts, and Ms. Christy Grady, and Ms. Ashley Wilder-Dickey, are part of the team bringing these events to you today. At the conclusion of the talk, please use the QR code that's scattered about the room to share feedback. Also scattered about the room are flyers with the other events of this season. I hope that you will join us on Saturday for the annual powwow in the MAC from 11 a.m. to 11 p.m. It sounds like a full day. Our keynote will be Tuesday, March 5th at 12:30 p.m., also in the MAC on the second floor, where New York Times bestselling author David Turer will talk about his most recent book, The Heartbeat of Wounded Knee. And now I have a surprise. I have 3 copies of Dr. Turer's book to give away. And so I have a little pop quiz, but like no grades, and you get a book. So the first question, faculty are excluded from participating in, so just students and community only. First one to name 3 departments in the College of Liberal Arts, and go. The red shirt.
History, English, and wisdom.
Woohoo! And you, sir, get a book. Flyer, because we're advertising. Okay.
Can I talk to my lawyer?
Okay. Second, the last two anybody can participate. So the Navajo Nation encompasses parts of 3 United States states. Who can name 2 of them? Okay, in the brown shirt, I saw you first.
Arizona and New Mexico.
Great. Anybody know the third?
Utah.
Yeah, but I don't have the 4th book. Okay, and the last one. Which of the following tribes have not been located in present-day Texas? Okay, so I'm going to give you 3 tribes. One of them is not located in present-day Texas. Caddo, Comanche, Shawnee. Who said Shawnee?
I'll have to hold the raffle in my class because I have the book.
Okay. I used the Shawnee because I grew up in a part of the country where they were located, and I knew that it wasn't Texas. I thought about
Though there were Shawnee in Texas. So, sorry to question the author of the quiz, but
I did consult, so other than my own brain.
I shouldn't have said it. Anyway.
It'll be okay.
Yeah, it's all about dialogue, right? Okay, so with that fun, let me introduce today's event. It's the opening day, baseball fan in the room, opening day of the season, and we have built out programming centered around the importance of Native and Indigenous peoples. These stories are often untold or misrepresented, and our very own Dr. Paul Conrad, Associate Professor of History, will help us understand exactly this. Dr. Conrad's work focuses on Indigenous peoples' confrontations with colonialism in North America, with particular interest in questions of captivity, forced migration, enslavement, and resistance. His research has been supported by grants and fellowships from organizations such as the McNeil Center for Early American Studies, the Phillips Fund for Native American Research, and the Clement Center for Southwestern Studies. His book, The Apache Diaspora, 4 Centuries of Displacement and Survival, was published in 2021 by the University of Pennsylvania Press. Please help me welcome and thank for participating Dr. Paul Conrad.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Dean, for that introduction. I'm honored to be speaking with you all today as a part of this year's Festival of Ideas. I want to second the thanks to all the organizers for their work in putting this together, and all of you for being here. So I'm not going to bury the lead, the argument here of my presentation today. Though I am not Native myself, I study Native American history because I think it's important. The more I learn about the Native American past and present, the more I'm convinced that we cannot understand Texas, we cannot understand the United States, we cannot understand the Americas more broadly without focusing on Native histories. And I hope to make you all believers of this as well, if you're not already. Too often, the histories of the hundreds of indigenous nations of this continent are siloed in narratives of American history. What I mean by that is they're discussed only in one place, usually at the beginning of the story. We might call this the preface or the first chapter, but they're largely absent from the rest. Now, I don't want to suggest that there hasn't been some progress on this front, especially due to the work of community activists. The curriculum in many places has improved. And of course, tribal nations and tribal colleges are also doing very important work to educate people about their own histories, cultures, and languages. But the work of education is always ongoing, and events like this festival provide another opportunity to shed more light on the importance of Native American history for understanding the society in which we live. So my aim today, my goal at the end of this presentation, is to hopefully leave you with at least one new idea about Native Americans and Texas history. One thing that might stick with you that you might remember tomorrow or the next week or 2 months from now. But first, following up on what Dr. Dean did, I'm going to check in with you to see what you already know with a quiz. Now, some of you I see a few of you who've been in my classes before and you know I like to do this. I see a few of you that have been in a presentation I've given before and know I like to do this. So you may think, great, I already know all the answers. That may be true, though I did update the quiz a bit. So if you already know, that's wonderful because I'm going to let you work together. So choose who you're sitting by wisely. I just ask that you not consult your phones or Google as you work on brainstorming answers to these questions. After I give you a few minutes to work on them, we'll come back together to talk about the answers and what I think they mean as a way of introducing the subject matter of my presentation today. All right, get to work. Talk to your neighbors, introduce yourselves, and see if you think you know the answers. How are you guys doing? You think you're good? You know the answers? No. Okay, that's okay. Do your best. Okay, good. Have you figured it out?
No.
Well, my jury doesn't.
I like your methods.
That's the one that's waiting.
I'm doing well. Good to see you.
World
It's been a
traveler,
while.
huh?
Yeah, it's good to be back in Texas for a bit.
Yeah, came all
So-
you were in Denmark?
Yeah, back for a week. So I'm here for this, for the powwow. Well, the powwow, and yeah. So yeah, well, I don't know about that, but thanks.
Josh, how you doing? Doing good yourself?
All right, I'm going to pause you wherever you're at, and let's see how you guys did. So let's start with question 1. So this is the 2020 census. How many Texas residents identified as American Indian or Alaska Native? How many of you thought A? Okay. B? Right? C? All right. Or D? All right, it looks like C won out. The correct answer is actually D, 794,000.
But the question was, the implication was solely as native. And the D is if you... Then leave it to the professor to question the question. You are correct. So in terms of what this is, it is as American Indian or Alaska Native, or as American Indian and something else. So it wasn't only American Indian. If it's solely, then the 200,000 and something is correct. Okay. But I'm impressed by how many of you thought C or D. So part of why I ask this question often to students is I'm surprised by how often when I talk to people, they assume the Native population is very small. So the fact that you guys know that it's larger is a good sign, I think. Number 2, federally recognized tribes in Texas. A, B, C, D. All right, good. The most were 3. See, this is an informed audience. The correct answer is 3. How many of you could name them? Could anyone name them? Yeah. All right, so you named very successfully tribes that had historical homelands in Texas. However, those tribes are now headquartered in Oklahoma. So the 3 federally recognized tribes in Texas are the Isleta del Sur Pueblo over by El Paso, the Kickapoo Band down on the border, and the Alabama Coushatta in East Texas. So the interesting thing, which kind of foreshadows some history that I'll talk about today, is that those are tribes that were displaced here from elsewhere. So it's interesting that the Texas tribes were forced out and are now headquartered elsewhere, though of course people from those tribes are living in Texas today. But the federally recognized tribes in Texas are people whose homelands were originally elsewhere and they were forced here through colonialism and forced migrations. All right, number 3, percentage living in urban areas. A, B, C, and D. All right, again, very informed audience. So the correct answer is more than 70%, around 70%. This is something that, again, with a less informed audience than you all, often the assumption is that the number is much smaller. Because often people, if they're exposed to news about Native Americans, the news often focuses on reservations in non-urban areas, when in fact the majority of American Indians live in places like Dallas, Fort Worth, Los Angeles, Denver, and so on. Number 4, percentage change in the population between 2010 and 2020. This is again the percentage change in people self-identifying, and it includes people identifying solely as American Indian or as American Indian and another category as well. Ken, I'm getting ahead of your question. So A, a few takers. B, -11. Population decline. Okay, C, 26%. Okay, quite a few takers for C. And then D, -2. All right. So I think C was the winner. The correct answer for this one is A, 152%. And that, in general, of course, the population of Texas grew between 2010 and 2020. But
the percentage change in the American Indian and Alaska Native population was the largest percentage change. Can anyone think of why that might be? How do we explain this large increase?
Jobs.
Okay, jobs. All right. Yeah.
Family history, talking about it and understanding your lineage.
Okay, family history. What was your name?
Carletta.
Carletta? Okay.
And by the way, I'm 100% today.
Okay, wonderful. So family history, talking about your lineage. So absolutely, part of this is people that are rediscovering so part of it is people rediscovering an aspect of their family lineage that maybe wasn't talked about as much before. Part of it is that in the past, now in the 2010 census, you were able to identify as more than one category, but increasingly there's a broader trend of people identifying as multiracial. And that's something that is a factor in terms of this increase in the American Indian population as well. Anything else come to mind? Yeah.
That in general, non-white people are moving to the Southwest as a general trend, not just.
Okay, so as a general trend in terms of the increase in the Texas population, the larger increase was in terms of non-white populations. Absolutely. Yeah.
It's now maybe more accepted to just like claim who you really are, you know, not hiding it as much, you know, whereas may have been looked down upon in the past to be something other than white, so now you're like claiming it because you're not afraid.
Yeah, what was your name?
Maddie.
Maddie. So Maddie said it's now more accepted to kind of claim who you really are. I think that's absolutely kind of along with the lines of thinking about family lineage and knowledge of family lineage. It goes that way as well. There was a period in time, certainly in Texas history and for Native peoples in Texas, in which it was very dangerous for people to know that you were Native. There's many Lipan Apache families, for example, that talk about, they were kind of identified by outsiders as being Hispanic. And it was, in a sense, even though they might have known otherwise, they kind of allowed that up to be the knowledge of them because of the overt hatred and racism towards Native people. So that's a part of it too. I will say that there can be a more insidious side to this as well, in terms of, some of you may know, I have some relatives that are like this that talk about having this Cherokee great-great-grandmother, and I've done the genealogy, and I'm like, there's no evidence of this whatsoever. So the kind of desire to identify as something other than white is something that we see happen, at least with some of this as well. People that may not actually have an ancestry or lineage, but are nonetheless claiming it. So it's a complicated issue. But the key point is, the Native population in Texas is large, it's growing. Native people live here in DFW, they're with us in this room. And understanding their history, their contribution to the history of Texas and to American history, I think is really important. All right. So I want to move now to discussing three key reasons that I think Texas history cannot be understood without Native Americans. My kind of three arguments about why you should think about Native history as a part of understanding Texas. Our time is limited, so I'm going to leave a lot out. I will recognize that. We can only do so much in 30 minutes or whatever we have. But I hope that my ideas will give you some food for thought and maybe spark you to want to learn more. So my first argument that I want to discuss is that the history of Texas is old. Now, what do I mean by that? Do I mean boring, stale? No. What I mean is that often the kind of traditional starting points of Texas history, of US history even, are quite recent. The focus is on the last few hundred years. But the history of this place, where we are now, did not begin with shipwrecks, wandering Spaniards, or with Anglo cotton farmers.
And I think when we think about that, it can be easy to understand intellectually. Okay, yes, there were societies here before Europeans, but I think much more work still needs to be done to unpack that point, to illustrate that point, to focus on it. Imagine, for example, if every world civilization class started in the year 1492, with only a brief mention of the fact that some stuff happened before then. Or if all European history classes started in 1492, with a brief mention of the fact that maybe some things happened before then. It would make no sense. But that's usually what happens with Texas history or with American history. Native history is this brief prologue, this prehistory, that then maybe briefly introduces the focus of the rest of the semester or the rest of the book. Now, one conventional explanation for why we don't talk more about the history of Native American societies before Europeans arrived has to do with source material. Can anyone explain that? Why is it that people say we can't focus more on this history? Yeah?
Is that the word history traditionally means written history.
Okay, so this bias towards written history. And most Native societies had different traditions in terms of how they kept knowledge, how they understood and found meaning in the past. They did so through storytelling, through oral traditions, not through writing things down. Though there were quite formal traditions among some groups of using mnemonic devices, for example, memory aids. Some of you may have heard of the Lakota calendar counts, for example, or among the Tohono O'odham of what's now Arizona, they had calendar sticks in which they kept notches to help the historian, the knowledge keeper, remember key events in their people's history. But this focus on written history is part of why people have argued, well, we can't say as much, or we can't focus on this pre-1492 history because there's not enough to go on. And this is, in fact, a challenge. I don't want to say that it's not a challenge to discuss Native history in this period before Europeans, but it can be done. And it can be done using multiple kinds of evidence and source material. For example, archaeological evidence points to many thousands of years of human presence in what is now Texas. We see that in sites across Texas, and there's been a lot of improvement and innovation in archaeological methods in recent years to be able to understand settlement sites that were of mobile groups. So mobile groups tended to not build structures that were as enduring as people that lived in cities and towns. But that doesn't mean that we can't identify their sites and learn a lot about them. And archaeologists have done a lot of work to better understand the archaeology of mobile peoples in recent years. We can learn a lot from things like cave paintings. And I have an example of one of those here from the lower Pecos Canyonlands. Rock art. People, even if they didn't have a system of writing, nonetheless used art and drawings as a way of memorializing their cultures and identifying important events in their past. And in addition to archaeology and other types of evidence, we also have the very important source of native oral traditions. So among the Mescalero Apache, for example, I've put up just one example of their tradition of origins in the north. So we were made in a land of ever winter. Bernard II says, on the shores of a big lake. We looked around, but there was always something to the south that drew us, and we started drifting that way. So among some Mescalero Apaches, there's this knowledge of an origin further to the north. That is supported by linguistic evidence. So both the Diné language and the Apache language is similar. It's from the same language family as the language that tribes speak in what's now Canada. So this Apache oral tradition of migration is also reflected in other source material as well.
So all of this kinds of evidence, archaeology, rock art, oral traditions, it points to fascinating stories from what is now Texas in the period before Europeans arrived. What we now call Texas was a crossroads of trade between the mountains and the Mississippi River Valley. Plains peoples used dogs to haul their hides and meat to trade for blankets, pottery, corn, and turquoise with their mountain-dwelling neighbors. Thinking about these thousands of years of history before Stephen F. Austin or Davy Crockett sparks us to think about Native American explorers and diplomats, about Native scientists who, though they might not have thought of themselves using that word, studied and experimented with the natural world around them. They sought to better understand cycles of nature and use this knowledge to better their societies through technological innovation. The Karankawa felled trees to make dugout canoes to navigate coastal waters. Coahuiltecans adapted crops that were first domesticated in what is now Mexico and adapted them to new soils and climates here in what is now Texas. This isn't to suggest that what we now call Texas was just a peaceful paradise before Europeans. Groups divided us from them. They had enemies. They went to war with each other. And this is in part why it's challenging to map the Native American homelands, the Native American territories, the Native American nations of what is now Texas. Because, as in other parts of the world, boundaries between nations shifted over time through migrations and conflicts, even as people also built deep connections to particular places where they lived over the long term. So you may have seen there's a number of popular maps of Native American homelands, and it's a part of a tradition that I think, on the one hand, is useful because it helps people to think about how full the landscape was with people and with different nations at the time that Europeans arrived. But it also can be a dangerous tradition because it is so static. It puts Native Americans in kind of one place in time without showing the dynamic history that they had. One project that I think is useful, though, and I think I would encourage you to explore on your own, is the nativeland.ca project. So this is a screenshot. You can navigate to the website, but if you pull up Texas, you can see, and I know it's hard to make out the tribal names from a distance, but you see this, kaleidoscope of color, right? And I think that represents to you, again, both how full of nations the landscape was, but also this point I'm trying to make about them having this dynamic history over the course of thousands of years in which groups' territories expanded, contracted, people moved, they followed and sought out new trade networks, and so on. So I encourage you to take a look at this project and explore places of interest to you and see what indigenous peoples inhabited or continue to inhabit those places in the past and in the present. Now, to summarize my first point, this idea of Texas history being old, we cannot understand the scope of the history of this place we now call Texas without delving into thousands of years of Native American history. But it's not just at the beginning that Native American history mattered. There's also much still to learn about the importance of Native American histories after the arrival of Europeans, which brings me to my second argument, my second point, that I'm going to call Beyond Chapter 1. So looking beyond just the beginning of the story. So the arrival of Europeans was not the beginning of the history of Texas, and it was also not the end of Native American history in this land. Colonization was destructive and significantly changed Native societies, but Texas remained very much a Native place. I want to look quickly now at a Spanish map from 1744 to help illustrate this point. Now, I'm going to ask you to say what you notice about this map, but before we get there, does anyone remember or know when the first Spanish person set foot in what is now Texas? Yeah.
I want to say it was the 17th century.
Okay, good guess, 17th century, but it was earlier than that, yeah?
Was it 1590?
1590. You're headed in the right direction. You're headed in the right direction. So the first Spanish explorers to sight Texas, what is now Texas, was in around 1519. That's sometimes in these books about Texas history. That's where Spanish Texas begins. I think the first people associated with Spain to set foot in what is now Texas was in the 1520s. So this map is from more than 200 years later, right? So 200 years after Spanish colonization begins, more than 200 years after Spanish colonization begins, this is what a Spanish map maker saw in Texas. What do you notice about this map? What do you see on it?
Little groups.
Little groups, right? Rivers. Children. Lots of people, right? So I'm fishing maybe for a kind of obvious point, which is that the landscape is full of people, and what kind of people? Native people, right? So even centuries after colonization begins, Spanish maps in the 18th century are still showing the Texas landscape full of Native American societies. They're showing how little territory was actually controlled by the Spanish, and the fact that Native societies like the Wichita, Caddo, Comanche, Lipan, and Mescalero Apaches, and more actually retained control of most of the territory. This map is interesting to me in the representations of people kind of across the landscape, but it's a part of a broader theme. Most Spanish maps in this period are actually quite realistic in the way that they portray the landscape. They show it as being full of native societies. Now, one of the most interesting stories in Texas history in this period, in the 18th century, is the story of the Comanche. Some of you may be familiar with this history. It's a fascinating example of some of the unintended consequences of colonialism. So the goal of the Spanish or French in North America was definitely not to help create powerful native societies like the Comanche. That's not, well, let's see, how can we make native people powerful? But in practice, this sometimes happened. It's sometimes what took place, not only in the South Plains, but in other regions as well. Because European animals, like horses, and European goods, like firearms, circulated through native trading networks, and groups would exploit those goods to their advantage in their competition with neighboring groups. So using this newfound power that was made possible in part by European animals and goods, the Comanche arrived in Texas during the 18th century with important consequences for both Europeans and for other Native Americans. A lot of my own research has focused on Apache or Inde peoples, and for them in this period, one of the biggest threats they faced was not the Spanish, but rather the Comanche and their allies. And one of the ways that Apaches adapted to this threat was through closer relations with the Spanish and Spanish settlements, including Spanish missions. One of my favorite sources from this time period is a 1747 report on the missions that existed at that time near where the Conchos River and the Rio Grande meet. It's along the present-day U.S.-Mexico border, right there where you see La Junta, okay? So in this 1747 report, Spanish officials have traveled to the missions there along the Rio Grande to see what's going on. And they're horrified to learn that the missionaries don't actually have any control. What they describe is that the Indians of the mission hear Mass when it suits them. They pray when they want to, but most of the time they go around on horseback trading with the Apaches. And this was common in various missions in Texas, that missions were often rather open places, meaning that natives came and went, they gathered when it was useful to them, and then they left. And Apaches and other natives, even those that had not formally received Catholic instruction and so on, would come and trade and leave as well. There were a lot of lonely priests much of the year because they had relatively few natives to try to instruct. This is an example of one element of native history and why it mattered in Texas history at this time. Now, Native American nations remained extremely important players even when the Spanish Empire collapsed, when Mexico gained its independence, and migrants from the US began flooding in the early 19th century. By focusing on Native American history in this period, we learned just how complicated interethnic relations in Texas were. So to the typical cast of Anglo and Mexican characters, we have to add Native American immigrants from the East, including Cherokees and Shawnees, in addition to the existing native nations who were already here. We have to think of famous events like the Texas Revolution or the US-Mexico War as being shaped by and having consequences not just for the US and Mexico, but also Native American nations here in Texas. Now, my colleague Sam Haynes, who's right here in the audience, has done incredible research on this period, and this is how he puts it in his recent book, Unsettled Land. And he's talking here about the early 19th century. He says, Texas remained, for all intents and purposes, a Native American world, inhabited by a constellation of peoples as culturally distinct as the region was vast. Some of the key research for his book was first featured in a digital project that he and our colleagues in the library developed that I urge you to explore on your own, just like the Native Land CA project. Encourage you to take a look at this Texas Borderland project that you can access from the UTA website. It's an amazing compilation of materials that's useful for research, useful for teaching, useful for just learning more about Texas history. And what I have on the right here is a screenshot of one of the mapping tools that you can access through this project. This is a heat map that's showing the places where interethnic violence happened and the frequency, the intensity. So the red is, of course, the areas where there was the most events, and then the blue is places where there was less, and so on. But this is just one example of the kind of tools that exist on that website to better understand this complex place where Native Americans were important players in addition to the Anglos and Mexicans that you might be more familiar with and have heard more about over time. Now, eventually, especially due to the growing Anglo population, power dynamics shifted, and Anglo-Americans pursued the elimination of Native Americans from the place they called Texas. The history of Anglo-Americans' exclusionary policies help explain the geography of Native American nations in and beyond Texas today. So like we talked about a little earlier, the federally recognized tribes of Texas, like the Kickapoo and Alabama Coushatta, have origins elsewhere, and they were displaced here by colonialism and US expansion. Meanwhile, the Texas tribes, like the Caddo Nation, are headquartered now in Oklahoma, formerly known as Indian Territory, the place to which many native nations were sent by the US and US settler colonialism. This is a map that represents those forced migrations of native nations to Oklahoma that shows, from all across the continent, the native peoples that were all sent to Indian Territory, to Oklahoma, including peoples from Texas, as you can see there. Now, I could spend much more time explaining the dispossession of Texas tribes, but I want to leave time for my third major argument, my third main point, what I'm calling the heartbeat of Texas Native history. This is a good moment to advertise the keynote speaker of this Festival of Ideas.
Dr. David Troyer, who's going to be presenting this coming Tuesday at 12:30 p.m. on the second floor of the MAC. There's a QR code you can scan up here on the front, and there's a flyer you can take a look at. But I definitely encourage you to come to that. David Troyer has written multiple books, but his most recent book is a response to another famous book. So there's a famous book by D. Brown that was published, I think, in 1970 that you may have heard of. The title of it is Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee. And it was a very influential book in terms of understandings of Native American history. It focused on this period of US expansion in the 19th century, but trying to emphasize Native American histories. And providing a Native American kind of perspective on that history. But one of the problems of the book is that it ends with the US massacre at Wounded Knee in 1890 and argues that that event was the destruction of Native American cultures. So that's the end of the story. That's where Native American history ends. And so David Troyer has written a book titled The Heartbeat of Wounded Knee to make the case that 1890 is not the end of Native American life. It's not the end of Native American histories. And though in the book he has a whole long chapter that deals with Native history before 1890, he then focuses a lot of the book on this dynamic Native history after 1890 to make the case that that is not an endpoint. So he's going to be speaking on Tuesday about that work. I've never heard him speak before, but I've heard he's really good. So definitely come to hear his talk on Tuesday if you can. So I think his point, this idea of Native lives, Native histories continuing after 1890, is one that can be usefully applied to Texas as well. We can think of the heartbeat of Native Texas history continuing here as well after 1890. Now, it's absolutely true that the late 1800s and early 1900s were a low point in Native history here in Texas and in the United States more broadly. Across the Americas, Native peoples had suffered population losses of more than 90%. By 1900, the US Census could claim that only a few hundred natives remained in Texas. But this wasn't the end of the story. So on the one hand, there's the story of Texas tribes that survived, regrouped, and rebuilt. So some Lipan Apaches, for example, managed to remain in their homelands. I mentioned earlier that their families were maybe labeled Hispanic, and they hid in plain sight, so to speak, even as they retained cultural knowledge. Other Lipans were scattered into Mexico. Some joined other Apaches at the Mescalero Nation in New Mexico after 1900. Others joined the Tonkawa in Oklahoma. So there's this scattering that happens, right? But today, Lipan Apaches are still here. They're playing a very important role in the present day Native community here in Texas. They're seeking federal recognition. And they remain a vibrant culture and community in our state today. Here in the DFW area, a key moment in the modern Native history of the area began after World War II, when Dallas was named a center for the Indian Relocation Program. So the Indian Relocation Program was this kind of new moment in US policy. In general, I would describe US Indian policy as schizophrenic. It's like we want to exclude natives. We want to eliminate natives. We want to forcibly integrate natives. And the US kind of cycles through these three things over time. But this is a moment where they're back to let's try to forcibly integrate them. So have natives leave the reservations and come to urban centers, and they'll join white society and stop being a unique culture. So that was the idea of the Indian Relocation Program, and Dallas was one of the relocation centers.
This is a flyer that was for Denver, but similar flyers existed for Dallas and give you a sense of the advertising, the marketing for the relocation program. So it was very rosy, of course. It talks about good jobs and training and happy homes and beautiful scenery and so on. So come, leave your communities, come to the urban centers, and everything will be great. Of course, in practice, it was very challenging. People had to, from many different tribes, came to cities like Dallas. They had to figure out how to get jobs. Often they faced discrimination in doing so. They missed home. They tried to, kind of reform community centers that could help them to survive, forming intertribal centers and churches and so on to kind of help their communities to thrive. More than 20,000 natives from dozens of different tribes, I think it was more than 90 different tribes, arrived in Dallas as a result of the Indian relocation program. And they've played a very important role in this community. The heartbeat of Native communities here in Texas is evident not just in the DFW community broadly and in the community organizations that people that came as a result of Indian relocation programs founded, but also specifically here at UTA. So I want to highlight a few aspects of modern Native history, of this heartbeat of Native history in Texas from right here at UT Arlington. So the longest continually running student organization in Texas is the Native American Student Association here at UT Arlington, which has been running for 30 years now. Really remarkable. The president of that organization is with us here today. So wave, Samson. And we also can count among our alumni people like Peggy Larney, who's featured here on the right. Peggy Larney led the drive for American Indian Heritage Day to be named in Texas. She's been a long-time community leader and activist involved in the public schools and in education around Native cultures in the public schools. She has her hand in many different things. But she's someone who's, again, been an important historical figure and present-day figure in this modern Native history in North Texas and specifically at UT Arlington. We count among our current students people like Stephen Silva Brave, who's a leader in the MMIW, the Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women movement, and also is very involved in our area community. This is also a good moment. Before I get to my next point, I'd also highlight that the university as a whole has also made strides to recognize the Native history of this place through adopting a land acknowledgement statement that recognizes the Wichita and affiliated tribes and the Caddo Nation. But also, and I would say especially importantly, they've established a courtyard for where the land acknowledgement statement is featured, that features native plants that were important to the native tribes of this area, and makes it a really kind of living statement where people can go and think about both the native history and the native present at this university and in the region as a whole. This is also the moment where I'll plug the next event, which is, again, a part of this modern Native history at UT Arlington in North Texas, is the powwow that the Native students here have been putting on for 28 years now. That is one of the most important and well-attended powwows in the region. And it's a part of this, the cultural history of this place. It's a vibrant event that people attend. I've talked to multiple people who are Native that come to this region from elsewhere, and they feel like they find community at events like this powwow. So come if you can. It's on Saturday in the MAC, starting at 11 a.m. and running all day. I especially encourage you to come in the afternoon and evening if you can. That's an especially good time to see the events, to watch the dancers, and experience the powwow. All right. So now to conclude, and then I look forward to your questions. Native Americans have been important throughout Texas history, from what we might think of as the preface, the beginning, through the body chapter, so to speak, to the present. We should think about thousands of years of history before the Spanish or the French or the Americans. We should think about the fascinating and dynamic histories that Native Americans shaped in the context of colonialism. And we should think about Native Americans in modern Texas history. Now, I want to end today by asking you to speak one more time with your neighbors, those that you worked on that quiz with. And what I'd like you to talk about before then I open it up to a broader discussion is whether there was one thing that stood out to you in what I shared with you today, and whether there was any question that you were left with based on any of the material I shared today. I'll give you just a minute or two to talk about that, anything that stood out to you, any questions you had, and then I'll open it up to a broader discussion. Thanks for sharing today.
I have a question. Do you know about the Diné-Yandisian language hypothesis?
It sounds familiar, but tell me a little bit more.
So it's a proposed linguistic grouping with a lot of evidence of the relation between the not Diné languages in Canada and the United States to the languages traditionally spoken in the Yenisei River Valley in Siberia.
Very interesting. I need to read more about that. I'm very familiar, of course, with the relationship among the so-called Athabascan languages, but and this Siberian connection sounds familiar. But I'll read more about that.
There's only one living Yeniseian language left.
Okay. Interesting. Thanks for mentioning that. I'll read more about that.
But the novel thing about it, aside from the trans-Bering Strait connection, is that the language, the proto-language was spoken at least 10,000 years ago.
Yeah, that's amazing.
And there's only a few languages that have been reconstructed that are that old.
That's a very old language.
The oldest language that's been reconstructed is Proto-Afro-Asiatic, and that's only because we have languages like Sumerian, ancient Hebrew, ancient Egyptian as well.
Yeah. Interesting.
From that branch in the first millennium BC and stuff.
Yeah. Are you a linguistics major?
I'm a linguistics minor.
Okay, cool. All right, I always hate to interrupt conversation, but I see people leaving, so I feel like I should interrupt and just ask, are there any questions, anything that I can answer, any comments, questions, anything on your minds? Yeah, Paul.
Dr. Conrad, you talked about this relocation program during World War II, or in the aftermath of World War II. I was wondering if that was something that was done benignly to try to assimilate, or if it was that, but also part of a land dislocation program, right?
Yeah.
Aims of closing down the reservations.
Yeah, that's a good question. It's both. It's both. So part of it is, you could say the more benign aspect is this idea of assimilation, of integration into U.S. society. But it's also the period after World War II when the U.S. was pursuing a policy called termination, which was to end the special government-to-government relationship between tribes and the U.S. government with, I think, the idea of dissolving everything that means, right, including sovereignty over land. So the larger goal was, of those that devised the policy, I think, was both things. So they integrate into white society, and then we're going to eliminate tribal nations. Yeah.
I was a little curious about the reservations of Texas or the lack thereof. So I was curious, I guess, if that has anything to do with Texas owning its own public land, and if so, how were, I guess the 3 reservations that do exist were the 3 that you mentioned of the tribes that were kind of from other places. Was that initiated by the federal government, the state government? Do you know anything about that, I guess?
So the question is about the relative lack of reservations in Texas as maybe compared to other places in the Southwest.
Yes.
Yeah, so I think my sense of the most important factor is the degree to which the degree to which Texas pursued the elimination of natives from Texas land in the 19th century. And it's not the only place that did so, right? So you could also ask, why are there relatively few reservations east of the Mississippi? And there's some similarities there. But I would say that is the most important factor. In terms of the nuances of Texas public land policy and so on, I'm not an expert on that, but I could point you in some directions. But I would say it's that 19th century history that is really most important in terms of why there are not larger and more reservations in Texas. Yeah?
I recall you mentioning that specifically the Apache are not federally recognized, but are working on the process of becoming federally recognized. What does that entail, and what kind of process do people have to go through in order for their tribe to be recognized?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and it's a very bureaucratic and onerous and complicated process that deals with a lot of, it's really driven by the dominant culture in society, meaning the US, right? So it involves demonstrating that you have been a people for a very long period of time. You have to show through historical documentation that you've resided in a particular place for long term. There's all of these kind of criteria that for various reasons can be hard for some tribes to meet, either due to displacement and forced migrations that's happened, due to scattering and regrouping and cultural change, due to intermarriage. So it's a complicated process. Also, I don't want to get into the weeds, but with Lipan Apaches, there's the added complexity that some Lipans are enrolled in federally recognized tribes because some ended up at Mescalero Apache in New Mexico and some ended up in Oklahoma. So the federal government places a very high burden on any tribe to gain federal recognition. The traditional way in which a tribe was seen as federally recognized was through a treaty. So the treaty was how they were recognized by the federal government. But the US is not still signing treaties with tribal nations. And we know how those treaties went. So it's a very difficult process. And I would just say this is a good moment to mention that there are a number of indigenous communities in Texas that do not have federal recognition, even though they've lived in their homes for hundreds of years and have had this long-term kind of cultural presence. So Colquiltecan groups, in addition to Lipan Apache groups. So that issue of recognition and federal recognition, state recognition, non-recognition is a really complicated one that the US often has also used to kind of divide tribes against each other in a way that is pernicious. Yeah?
I've been inspired for years by your work and Sam's work and Ken Phillips before you. Your title, I'm going to make a little plea here. You may have heard that for the last 4 years there's been a group working on a course on Native Studies for all public high schools in Texas. You may have also read in the newspapers that in January, a week before the state board met, our proposal was pulled for a lot of reasons I won't get into. Anyway, we are collecting, and we have more than 100 now, letters that go to the State Board of Education recommending that this course will be evaluated in April. If it doesn't get evaluated in April, it may be dead. As I said, 4 years have gone work, 18 tribes worked on it. If you belong to any sort of an organization that you think might be willing to write a letter saying that this should be considered in April. My email is roemer, R-O-E-M-E-R, @uta.edu, and I can send you the guidelines, who you have to send it to. But as I say, it's getting a bit desperate. It looked like we were really going to be there right on the same level with Mexican American and African American studies, and then it suddenly got cool. So if you are involved in any organization that might be interested in writing a letter of support, please contact me, and I can email you a copy of the whole course so you can look at it. So that's my plea.
Thank you for that plea, which I think is an example of both, on the one hand, the incredible work that people have done to illustrate the importance of Native American histories and cultures, but also the barriers and challenges that remain. So the fact that this course for public schools in Texas has not been adopted yet, hopefully it will, is, I think, a real example of that. So contact Dr. Roemer, Ken Roemer, in the English department, and you can learn more about how to help that effort. Yeah?
You mentioned the organization of missing and murdered Indigenous women, and I was just curious, what is that? I've heard that the missing rates for Indigenous women is really high. Why does that organization, what do they do? Why is that?
Yeah, so the MMIW exists because unfortunately there is an epidemic of violence against Native women. They're disproportionately targeted in the US and elsewhere, in Canada as well. And so that organization grew up to try to push back against that violence, to help find people that are missing. And there's people involved in it here in North Texas as well. So if I encourage you to learn more, and they have events where you can learn more about how to assist and so on as well. If you search for MMIW Texas, and yeah. Thank you for the question.
I have a question.
Yeah.
I have a copy of a book by a local historian here in Arlington, O.K. Carter, who wrote his latest edition that includes the historical history of Arlington.
Yeah, great.
And he says that the main branch of the Caddo that lived in Arlington was the Hassanai. Hassanai. I can't find very much information about when I try to find out about that branch. I mean, do you know about that branch?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that can be hard, so when you're trying to find out more information, is that the contemporary nations, which are definitely a resource for learning more about these histories, are the Caddo Nation and then the Wichita and affiliated tribes. And so groups that had distinct identities in the past, even if they spoke the same language and so on, now have been incorporated into those modern nations. So if you search for resources for Caddo and for Wichita and affiliated tribes, I encourage you to look at those tribal nations sites. There's historians with those tribes that are also doing work on their own history, and they can provide you more information. But it's sometimes helpful to know, what should I be searching for or looking for? And Caddo and then Wichita and affiliated tribes are the present day nations whose ancestors were living in this region.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah?
So two things. First, when we talk about how many people in Texas have Native ancestry, so the largest ethnic group in Texas, in terms of the census categories, is white Hispanic. But a lot of the people who are under that category have around half Native ancestry, but it's just natives from south of the Rio Grande. So there's a lot more people with Native ancestry than is indicated by the American Indian or Alaska Native category.
Yeah, that's it. So that's a great point. If we're talking about indigenous ancestry, of course, we're not just talking about people who are a part of or descended from tribes that are now within the boundaries of the United States. Indigenous peoples are, Native Americans include people throughout the Americas, and people that are Latino, Hispanic, and so on also have indigenous ancestry. So that census category is artificial in that way. I know even in terms of Native students at UTA, how they're categorized by UTA can be sometimes strange, where it seems to be, in some cases, just based on last name. So I've had several Native students who tell me, UTA says I'm Hispanic, but I'm not Hispanic at all, but their last name is a last name that looks to be Latino. So those issues of ancestry and so on, and accurately counting, so to speak, are very complicated, and it's an absolutely good point to say, if we're talking about Native ancestry broadly, not just talking about tribes in the United States, then the numbers are much larger than 750,000 or whatever I said, because as you point out, many Latinos in Texas also have indigenous ancestry from elsewhere in the Americas.
I forget the second thing I was going to say.
All right, well, feel free to come say hi and talk to me, but thank you all for coming.